Hey everyone, welcome to our C# tutorial on functions. As you can see, I have Visual Studio pulled up and our boilerplate code ready. To start off this lesson on functions, let's just define what a function is. I have a two-part definition of a function that I like. And so we can begin by defining a function as a code block that contains a series of statements. So you remember previously in our tutorials on if statements, we talked about how scope is defined with an opening curly brace and a closing curly brace. Inside of those curly braces was the code that got executed if the if statement was true. A function is similar in that it contains two curly braces that has a series of statements that runs when the function gets called. And you might hear me slip up and call a function a method during this tutorial. Those two things are very similar, and we'll get into the distinction between them a little bit later in this course. For now, we can define a function as a code block that contains a series of statements. So now I'd like to add a second piece to this, and it's not as much a definition as it is the way a function is used. And so we can say a program causes the statements to be executed by calling the function and specifying any required parameters. Okay, so this second sentence is more about how you use a function. And a program can use a function by calling that function and giving it the parameters needed. So now we'll get into what a parameter is a little bit later, because the parameters play a crucial role in the creation and execution of a function. Right now, what I'd like to do is I'd like to take this console write line and make it a little bit more flexible. So instead of printing out to the console hello world, I'd like to print out hello and then a person's name. So to do that, we're going to create a function. And we can start out by writing the return type of that function. And so we're actually not going to have a return type for this example. So I'm going to write in void. You can't really create a variable with the type of void because a variable always needs to contain something. However, unlike a variable, a function doesn't always need to return something. So when a function does not have a return value, we say that that is a void function. So I'll add that definition up here. A void function is a function that does not, I'll put it in all caps, have a return value. So we're going to have a void function here because it's not going to return a value. Now I'm going to, and so the void part of this function is the function type. And the function type is the type of value the function returns. So now I'm going to give the function a name in the same way that I give a variable name. And so this function is going to greet people by saying hello and then that person's name. So I'll call this function greeting. And I'm going to type this in our list of definitions here. So I'll say function name, the name that you call the function. And so just like a variable, we refer to the function by its name. And so now I'm going to create these opening and closed parentheses. And inside of these parentheses is where you put your parameter, or your parameter list, I should say. So a parameter list is exactly what it sounds like, a list of parameters, but what is a parameter? So we can define a parameter as information that is passed into functions, right? So a parameter is just a piece of information that is passed into a function. However, once it's inside the function, a parameter acts as a variable inside a function. And so this part can sound a little bit confusing, but all that means is that once we pass in a variable into the code body, or the body of the function, the code block, then that parameter acts as a variable. And so we'll put a parameter, we'll add a parameter to this function in just a minute. But right now, what I'd like to do is I'd like to open up the code block or the scope of this function. And so as you see, these curly braces define the scope of the function. And this is where we would, I'll come back. This is where we would put our instructions or our statements to be executed. And so for this function, we want it to write out to the console a hello greeting. So let's copy this line here, and I'm actually going to cut it. And we'll delete these other lines, and we'll paste this hello world into our function. So now, when we call our function by using its name, it will run the instructions in between these two curly braces. The instruction we have written here is print to the console hello world. So now I'd like to make it flexible so that it can print out hello and then somebody's name. So let's create a name parameter in our parameter list space. So I'm going to delete this comment, and I'm going to create a parameter in the same way that you would define a variable, sort of. So I'll start with the type. I'll say it's going to be a string because we want it to be a word for a name, and we want to print that out here in this print strings. So let's call our parameter name. Cool. So now, once we start to execute this function body, we're going to have access to a variable called a name inside of this scope. So what we can do is we can delete the world part of hello world, and we can add name. And so obviously, this name parameter will exist as a variable only inside of this scope. Once we leave this scope down here, name is not valid. So you cannot use name here. So this function is defined right now, so that's great. So if we look back to our definition on what a function is, we can see that a function is a code block that contains a series of statements. Cool, we have that. We have a code block that contains a series of statements. Now, let's look at the second part of this definition. A program causes the statements to be executed by calling the function and specifying any required parameters. Okay, cool. How do we call a function? All we do to call a function is we just write its name. We say greeting. This calls the function, right? But what about the second part? Specifying any required parameters. As you can see, when we just call greeting with no parameters, it's throwing an error. That's because when we defined this function, we said it needs a parameter. So we cannot call this function without giving it a value here. So we can pass variables and values in as parameters. So I could create a variable named first name and pass it in to greeting, and it would work. But I can also just create a string called Pete and pass it in to greeting, and it works the same. So Let's run this and see what happens. So what we're doing is we're calling greeting and we're passing in the value Pete. And actually, let's try something else. Let's also call greeting and let's pass in the value John. Let's run this code. And what do you think we'll see when our console window pops up? We see hello Pete and hello John. Cool. So what's happening here is when we run our code, the computer sees, oh, they're using the function greeting because it sees a greeting defined down here. It says they're using the function greeting. Okay, cool. We know what to do when somebody says greeting. We take a name that they pass in here and we write it out to the console in this line here. So the computer sees, okay, this is Pete. We'll print out hello Pete to the console. And it did. And next, it's for the next instruction, it saw, oh, okay, we're seeing they're calling greeting again, but this time they're passing in John as a parameter. And so it runs the code for hello John. And that gets printed out right over here. So that's the basics of how a function works. Now I'd like to touch on one last thing, which is why use a function? So why would you use a function? Why not just type out console write line a couple times or whatever set of instructions you want to? Well, using functions allows you to reuse the same set of code. So if we had like a complex mathematical set of instructions that we wanted to execute, we could just write a function that would execute those instructions, and we could use it over and over and over again by just calling its name. So you could imagine how tedious it would be and how much time it would take to write in a complex mathematical function over and over and over again. And then if later you needed to change that mathematical function, you would have to change it in several different places all over your code, and you'd have to find those places. If you just create a method, you can call that method once, twice, as many times as you want to, and it executes the same amount of instructions every single time. And if you ever need to change those instructions, you just change those instructions in one place. You don't have to change it all over your code. Now, this might seem like a very small detail or a small amount of time savings, but it's actually a massive amount of time savings when you consider how much code you have to write to get a program to get any functional program to execute successfully. Okay, cool. So this was your first tutorial on functions. We covered a void function, the function types, what a function is, how to use it, what parameters are, and why we would want to use a function. In the next tutorial, we'll be talking about return types and functions. Thanks.